Thank you so much for that, and thanks everyone for turning up on a fairly chilly night. I came all the way up from the far south coast thinking it was going to be warmer up here. Holy smoke, that yesterday morning out there with Jono was one of the coldest mornings I've ever had on salt water in Australia. It was cold enough by the mercury, but then you add that 10, 12 knot westerly to it as well, and then drive into it, and oh yeah, I was pretty numb. But anyway, it was good. We had a terrific day. I turned 65 last month. It's a bit scary, and I caught my first fish when I was about 5 years old. So that means I've been fishing for 60 years, which is a daunting amount of time. And the first thing that most of the younger generation say when they hear that is, "Oh, geez, you were lucky. You got to fish in the good old days." Everyone reckons, the further back you go, the better the fishing must have been. And I think if you could go back far enough, it would be. If you could find a time machine and go back 1,000 years, can you imagine? I'd want to take the gear I had today, though, and one of my Lowrance sounders and a boat, But can you imagine what the fishing would have been like back in those days? But as far as the good old days having been in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, I'm not so sure about that. I've got a hunch that for a lot of the fishing that we're doing these days, we're actually living right smack in the middle of the good old days right now. And I know that it's probably going to take a little bit to convince some of you of that. So let's start at the beginning, and I'll go back to... now we've got a low battery light come on here, so we might need to plug some power in. As I said, I caught my first fish, it would have been 1964. I grew up as the son of a copper, and he got transferred all over the state. We lived in a lot of different parts of New South Wales. We were living in Condobolin at the time, which is almost the geographic centre of New South Wales. And my mum won a little rod and reel on remember the old chocolate wheel at the local fete? And she won a little solid fiberglass rod and reel with a closed face. I still remember it, red reel on top of it. I don't know what brand it was. It was a pretty disreputable bit of gear. But it came pre-rigged with a little frog-coloured wonder wobbler lure. And my mum and dad used to fish, but just with a hand line wrapped around a Coke bottle, a worm, and they'd catch silver perch and yellow belly and stuff out of the Lachlan River. And my attention span was too short to find it fun to sit there and hold the line and wait for something to eat the worm. So I wandered along the bank chucking this wonder wobbler out, and I was just fascinated watching this lure come through the water as I reeled it in on the little closed space reel. And then an amazing thing happened. A redfin about the size of that one, I caught that one just a couple of years ago in a local dam, but a redfin about that big jumped on my little wonder wobbler, and I just freaked out. I stopped winding, ran backwards up the bank, dragged the fish flapping up through the dirt, and I was absolutely hooked. It was the most exciting thing that had ever happened in my 5 years of life up to that stage. So I was hooked on fishing from that time on, and I did a lot of fishing. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos of me as a real little kid fishing because we lost everything in the big floods of the Bega River in 1970-71. So my next shots of me fishing are as probably a 14, 15-year-old. And by that stage, we'd moved to Bomaderry, Nowra, on the south coast of New South Wales. And I got involved with the local sport fishing club, the Answer Club, and a bunch of guys my age and a bit older. A couple of them were old enough to have their L plates and then their P plates and their first cars. And we used to fish the rocks out at Jervis Bay. I went absolutely nuts on that, chasing particularly pelagics, but also things like drummer and bream and groper and all those kind of fish. And we fished a whole bunch of different rock ledges on both the north and the south side of Jervis Bay. That was my stomping ground, and on the weekends that was where we went. That shot on the left there is a spot it was a big walk to get there, and we actually put that peg in and concreted it in one day, and we used to hang a rope, had a loop in the top of the rope and hang it down over the cliff and climb down. There's no way I could get into any of those sort of spots these days, but fantastic memories and great rock fishing in that part of the world. Used to do a lot of lure casting and a bit of live baiting and things like that, and then I really got into the live baiting at a spot called the Outer Tubes, which is inside Jervis Bay. A lot of you, if you're fishing nuts, you'll know about this spot. You'll have seen probably Phil Atkinson's video, Land-Based Addiction and Marlin from the Rocks, those great videos that Phil made in the 90s. Well, this is back even earlier. This is the mid-70s. That shot was taken in about 1974, and they're an old set of torpedo tubes that were put in there during the Second World War, when they were worried that the Japanese might actually invade and come in through the entrance of Jervis Bay. So there was a set on the northern side and another set on the southern side of the entrance of Jervis Bay, so they could fire torpedoes and transect the mouth of the bay. There's very little left of them nowadays. Just in the 40 years since then, most of it's rusted away and been vandalised, but there were quite a bit of the torpedo tubes left in those days. It's a remarkable spot. It's a land-based spot, and yet they catch massive tuna, marlin. There have been all kinds of amazing big game fish caught there off the rocks. It's pretty well known right throughout the world as one of the best land-based game fishing spots. And that sort of became my home just about every weekend. I finished high school and went to uni, and I was in Sydney during the week, and then I'd jump in with a mate and drive down the coast on a Friday night, and we'd walk into the Tubes or Big Beecroft or Devil's Gorge or one of those spots on Jervis Bay and fish all weekend. We put in a lot of hours. We hooked and lost a lot of fish. We were mad keen answer fishermen, so we were always fishing too light, and the kingies used to blow us away all the time. It was pretty rare to get even a kingy that size out on the gear we were using, but we did get some nice tuna. That's a long tail. We called them Northern Blues back in those days. And finally, in 1979, I got lucky and actually got a marlin off the rocks, only a little one, but I joined a fairly elite club there. At that stage, there'd only been about, I worked it out, probably about 20 marlin caught off the rocks by 1979 when I got that one. Nowadays, it's in the hundreds, and there've been some big ones caught off the rocks. But it was pretty cool for a 19-year-old to catch a fish like that off the rocks, and it was sort of a payoff for all the hours that I'd put in out there, I guess. But I wasn't just doing that land-based game fishing. I loved all kinds of fishing. I got bitten by the fly bug about that time. We were a long way from trout water, but I used to fly fish in salt water for things like mullet and tailor and brim. And it sowed a bit of a seed of passion that stayed with me forever. I still probably rate fly fishing as my absolute favourite form of fishing. But I do everything. I bait fish, I fish with greenweed for blackfish, I fish with soft plastics for brim. I've always tried to be an angler who's willing to have a go at absolutely everything, and I really enjoy it all too. I don't just sort of specialise in one thing. I finished uni, I trained to be a high school teacher, and my first posting was to Bourke, about as far out west in New South Wales as you can get. I think I made the mistake, because I'd spent 4 years at uni in the city and I really wasn't enjoying city life all that much, and when they asked us to nominate where we wanted to go for our first posting, I just said as far away from Sydney as possible, and they took me at my word. Sent me to Bourke. I've been there for 2 weeks and they tried to transfer me to Wilcannia, and I said, no, this is far enough out, I'm staying here. It was good fun. I had a great time in Bourke. It was a bit too far from the salt water for me, but I got into shooting and hunting and quite a lot of fishing. The fishing out on the Darling River in those days, this is 1979-80, it was dominated by carp. The carp plague, that was about one of the few Murray cod. I caught that little one on the left there. But the carp plague had arrived just 2 or 3 years before I did, unfortunately. The carp had been spreading up down through the Murray and then up the Darling, and a succession of floods that allowed them to get to Bourke a couple of years before I did. And you could just about walk across the river on the back of the carp, as often happens with those exotic pest species. When they first arrive in an area, they absolutely boom, and there's massive numbers. And really, we would have caught 50 to 100 carp for every native fish that we caught in those days. It was just completely dominated by carp, and sadly, it's heading back that way at the moment out in those western rivers. After these recent floods, the carp numbers have absolutely boomed. So I was feeling a bit homesick. I was missing the salt water and got pretty sick and tired of fishing for carp. So when a job opportunity came up to become a fledgling deputy editor of a fishing magazine, I jumped at it, got out of school teaching, became assistant editor of Fishing World magazine. And luckily, after about 3 or 4 months, my idol, the guy I'd grown up reading his articles, Ron Calcutt, who's the bloke on the far right there, and also in the boat, he was the publisher and the editor of Fishing World magazine. He actually handed over the reins to me and I became the editor of Fishing World, and I did that for about 4 years. Got to travel around the country and do all sorts of exciting things. Ron often used to say to me that I was a lucky bugger because I arrived on the scene just at the time when fishing magazines were really starting to get quite a big readership and good advertising. And also they were being recognised by tourism organisations, not just around Australia, but around the world. And I'd only been there working for a couple of months, and I answered the phone one day and it was a guy with a Canadian accent from the Canadian Embassy, and he said, "Have you got a passport?" And I said, "Yeah, I have actually," because I'd done my first overseas trip the previous year while I was at uni and actually gone to New Guinea and done a bit of a hiking trip around New Guinea. I said, I've got a current passport. He said, "Well, how would you like to fish for giant bluefin tuna in Canada?" And I said, "When?" He said, "Next Wednesday." So I packed my bags, jumped on the plane and took off, and we went to Prince Edward Island in Nova Scotia on the eastern seaboard of Canada. Myself and 21 other magazine editors from around the world. I was 21, I might have just turned 22 at the time, and I was by far the youngest of the 23 editors that were there. We fished for about 10 days. It was pretty tough fishing, tough conditions, and on the second last day there was only one other tuna caught while I was there. The run was really in dire straits in those days. Part of that whole thing about the good old days, that bluefin tuna run had completely crashed. It had been overfished. The only fish that were left were a few giants. They were too big to be held on long line gear, so they were only being caught on rod and reel. And really, we were there, even though we were clients for a charter boat fishery, we were there really just to fight the fish and bring them in so that the commercial crew could take them and ship them off to Tokyo, and they were sent off as sashimi the next day. Anyway, to cut a long story short, on the second last day, I hooked that. An Atlantic bluefin tuna that weighed 1,020 pounds, and I won the competition. It's the biggest fish I've ever caught in my life at 22 years of age, and I'll never catch a bigger one. I don't really want to catch a bigger one. It was the scariest thing to be attached to that fish on 130-pound game tackle. 2 or 3 times it literally nearly tore me out of the chair and into the water. They're just an amazing animal. Whoops, we've lost. What was the fight time? 45 minutes, not all that long, because we're in very shallow water. The water there's only about 120 feet deep, whatever that is in metres. And so the fish just do these big screaming long runs, and then you chase them. But they fish with really stiff drags. We had 45-pounder drag on the reel, and to hear that line crackle off that reel under that much pressure was just the most amazing thing. So I peaked early as a fisherman. It's all been downhill since then. Anyway, then I got involved with the Rex Hunt show. I actually ended up, after that trip to Canada, I ended up moving to Canada for a year. I did a couple of other trips to Canada, loved the place, dragged my young family over there, and we lived for a year in Canada, and I was the editor of a fishing magazine over there, but it was too bloody cold. The winters are so long. So I came back to Australia and ended up getting an invite to appear on the Rex Hunt show with Rex, and that led to a decade of being a co-presenter on the Rex Hunt show, which was an absolute amazing trip. We travelled all over the world. Rex, he's a larger-than-life character. He's really something. What you see on the screen is very much what he's like in real life, and it was quite an experience to travel the world with him and the crew. It also, of course, hooked me up with Bushy, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I was writing books and stuff at the time as well. I've written about 15 or 20 fishing books over the years, trying to sort of eke a living as a freelance. I'd left Fishing World back in '84 and gone out on my own. So writing books and magazine articles and things like that. And then the squidgy phenomenon came along. So working with Rex, I got to work with Bushy. In fact, I worked with Bushy a lot more than I worked with Rex. He'd send us off to locations and we'd do stories on our own, and we had an absolute ball. People ask me who's the best fisherman I've ever met in my life. I don't have any hesitation in naming Bushy as that person. He's just one of the most phenomenal anglers I've ever fished with. And together we came up with this idea. Well, we were getting hooked on soft plastics. I mean, soft plastics have been around for a long time, but we had all that wonderful finesse gear, you know, it was what Guesty was talking about before. Suddenly we had the fine braided lines and the graphite rods and the really good spin reels and all this finesse gear. And little hard-bodied lures were great, and we were catching a lot of brim on them. This was when brim were being turned from a bread and butter fish into a sport fish, and we were at the leading edge of that, and we were loving it, and we were fishing the tournaments and everything. And then we started catching them on soft plastics. But you just couldn't get the right soft plastics in Australia to do it. You know, most of what we had here were hand-me-downs from the American market. They were too big. There wasn't enough finesse in them to catch brim consistently. So I don't know if any of you remember the old bucket of, I think they were called bucket of bait, and it was a bucket of soft plastics. And you'd buy, they were about $9 in those days, which was a bit more money than it is now. And we'd buy these things and dig through them, and most of it was crap. It was plastic lizards and salamanders and frogs and stuff. We didn't know how to use any of that. But there'd be a couple of little curly tails in there, little pink curly tails, and we were catching brim on them. And we were both sponsored anglers by Shimano at the time, and the then boss of Shimano, John Dunphy, came to us and said, look, you blokes have gone mad on these soft plastics. Why don't you design some for us and we'll sell them in Australia? And that's how the whole squidgies thing started. So Bushy and I sat down and we drew exactly what we wanted as soft plastics, and they sent it off to the factories in China, and we got the prototypes back. It looked absolutely nothing like what we'd sent over. We'd tell them they were crazy, you know, looked like goldfish and stuff. And eventually we got it right, and we ended up with a range of squidgies, and yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. And we both travelled around the country doing squidgy nights and presentations and things, and teaching people how to use them. And it was a great few years. I mean, squidgies sort of owned the Australian market there for the first 10 years of the soft plastic revolution, and it was really cool. What I used to love was going to somewhere where people were a bit sceptical. I always remember the one we did in Hobart in Tasmania, and we flew in and we did this squidgy night, and it was a big audience, and most of them were pretty sceptical. You know, I'm not going to catch fish on these little rubber things. You know, they all use pilchards and bait and squid and everything. And we went back a year later, and the same blokes are coming up to us and showing us the photos of all the fish they've caught on the squidgies. That was a real buzz to see it really change the face of Australian fishing. So, yeah, it was quite a ride being involved in the squidgies. But I always tried to sort of keep doing a lot of other stuff as well, you know, whether it be beach fishing for dewies or catching brim on bait, or I've always loved my rock fishing, and I still do a fair bit of rock fishing. I don't get into some of the places I used to when I was a bit younger, but I do love my rock fishing. About the same time, I met my second wife, Jo. All that travel with the Rex Hunt Show and everything meant that I saw very little of my two kids as they grew up, and I think it really probably ended up costing me my first marriage, even though it was a wonderful time of my life and I got to travel all over the world and everything. I just wasn't home very much. So I was single and met this wonderful woman called Jo from Darwin on a squidgy night actually in Darwin. She came along. She was a mad keen angler. A squidgy night. Yeah, it sounds interesting, doesn't it? That's what we used to call them. But she had a little daughter from her previous marriage, and her daughter was interested in fishing, but the only kinds of fishing she was interested in was soft plastic fishing. So, cut a long story short, she brought her daughter along, and we met and fell in love. And I ended up moving to Darwin for 3 years to live with them. We got married in the Cook Islands. Jo is a mad, with fly rod in hand and chasing bonefish on the flats in the Cook Islands and Aitutaki. That was our wedding and honeymoon. We eloped and did that. And yes, yeah, fantastic place. Love Aitutaki. If you ever get a chance to go to Aitutaki, it's just paradise on earth. It really is. I'd love to get back there. And Jo, as I said, had been quite a keen fisher, but she has absolutely blossomed and started her own women's recreational fishing league, and her aim is to reach parity by 2050. In other words, 50-50 fishermen, women and men by 2050. And we've got a lovely lady over here, Loz, from from WRFL, who is actually selling some raffle tickets tonight to help get some of the girls up to the tackle show this year. So they're actually not raffle tickets, it's a 100 club thing, and if they all get sold tonight, we'll find out who wins, and you get quite a nice little kicker of cash there. So come up and have a talk to Loz. But yeah, Joe and I, we then moved back to, well, I lived in Darwin for 3 years, as I said, did lots of barra fishing and stuff up there, absolutely loved Darwin. But I was yearning for my South Coast stuff as well, and it was just a matter of talking the girls into coming back down with me. I brought them down for a few holidays and they absolutely loved it. We were packing up to leave to move back down to New South Wales when I caught probably the most impressive fish that I caught while I was in Darwin, which is still the world record queenfish on fly. It was a massive fish that I caught in Darwin Harbour on a fly rod just a couple of weeks before we left. Am I doing the right thing leaving Darwin? But anyway, while we were up there, we also got to visit places like East Timor and fish there, and that was all pretty terrific as well. I've always loved my fly fishing, as I said, and I love my fly fishing for trout. We used to have regular holidays to New Zealand. We've actually started going more to Tasmania in the last couple of years, and also fishing a fair bit in the snowy mountains in New South Wales. But I do love fly fishing for trout. Also got a little bit addicted to chasing Murray cod at places like Copeton and that for a couple of years. I'm sort of a bit of a serial enthusiast. I think I get locked into one thing for a couple of years and then move on to something else. The cod fishing was fantastic, but hard work. I'm just about to go out and have another crack at it for the first time in a couple of years, but I really do enjoy chasing Murray cod. Flathead and dewies, we've heard a fair bit about tonight. I chase those a fair bit down in my local estuaries. I'm one of the 10 people in the Churros tagging campaign who's got a tagging kit down there. We haven't tagged anywhere near the number of fish that have been tagged up here or even in St George's Basin, but we have a crack and tag them. We seem to have a much briefer window of opportunity down there because of the very cold winters. Our best flathead fishing is October, November, December for the big ones, and then we get heaps of smaller ones through the summer months. But I go out and target them during that fairly brief window in late October, November and early December, and try and tag a few every year. I've been fortunate enough to have one of my tagged fish, in fact that one that I'm holding there in the photo, was recovered about a year later. Someone was asking before about how much they grew. That one only grew, I think it was 82 when I tagged it and about 83.5 when it was recovered. So they slow right down when they get up to that bigger size. But it was pretty cool because that was one of the 19 that was mentioned before that I actually put on the tag card that it was bleeding slightly from the gills. It had swallowed a big swim bait, and when I was getting the hooks out I bumped one of the gill arches and it was actually bleeding from the gills and didn't look all that healthy at all when I let it go, and I wrote that on the tag card. So it was a real buzz to see it recaptured 11 months later, and it was in really good nick. It had put on weight, grown a centimetre and a half. So don't worry too much if you see a little bit of blood coming out of a fish that you're releasing. As long as it swims away, it's got a much, as I always say, it's got a much better chance back in the water than it has in the esky. So don't be afraid to do that. And it was really interesting to hear the stories tonight about fish, with hooks down in their guts and cut off the leader and let them go, and they still get recovered. So yeah, they're a bit more resilient than we possibly give them credit for. Okay, this slide here is one that I used in a presentation I did last year down in Murray Cod Country, talking about, and I called that one, "These Are the Good Old Days," that we're living in now. And I used that slide to illustrate the way we tended to think about things like Murray cod and yellowbelly back in the 1800s and even well through into the 1900s, into the 70s and 80s even. Murray cod and yellowbelly were a fish that were caught mostly on set lines or in fish traps and all sorts of legal and semi-legal ways, and most of them were killed and eaten. And that has changed dramatically in my lifetime. The whole attitude towards things like our native freshwater fish has changed, and that's one of the reasons why I think that the times we're living in now are really, really good, and there's a lot of positives. There's some negatives too, and I'll touch on those as well. But these days we've got fantastic empowerment fisheries for golden perch and Murray cod. It pains me to say it, but my wife has caught 2 bigger Murray cod than I have. That was a 116 centimetre fish that she caught on a surface lure, crack of dawn on Copeton one morning when it was about -2 degrees, and to see that thing come up out of the depths and take a lure off the surface was pretty special. She's also no slouch when it comes to catching golden perch or yellowbelly. And we love our cod and yellowbelly fishing. And, you know, when I lived in Burke all those years ago, and the river was just full of carp and we hardly caught any cod, and whenever anyone did catch a cod out there in those days, they wouldn't tell you it was that big. They'd tell you it was that big because that's how long they are when they're hanging up on a meat hook in the chiller, you know, at the local pub. They're not lengthwise, they're vertical. They all got killed. And it was the same with big flathead. You know, I grew up in an era when most caravan parks had a tree where people nailed the head of the big flathead that they caught. They all got killed, they all got eaten, and for that reason I never caught a big flathead until really the 70s or 80s, when a few people started letting them go. And nowadays, when most of us do the right thing, you've got a much better chance of catching an 80, 85, 90 centimetre flathead today than you did 30 years ago, trust me. Things are definitely on the improve. So there's been a lot of improvements. The younger generation in particular, I'm finding that their attitudes towards fishing are completely different to us older generation. They're much more interested in the conservation of fish and preservation of fish habitats. So that's another good news story. Things have really changed. You know, the magazines that I used to write for have largely disappeared. Everything's gone online these days. I've had to go online myself. I'm an old dinosaur like me. I've got my own YouTube channel now, and I've got Facebook pages and Instagram accounts and everything else. And there's so much interchange of information out there now on the internet that it can be a good and a bad thing. People that want to do the wrong thing can still find out where the fish are and go and do the wrong thing, but I'm increasingly finding that more and more people are doing the right thing. So yes, there's been some losses. I've seen some fisheries decline in my time. I watched the inshore yellowfin tuna fishery around Montague Island and the Banks and Bandit Reef and some of those reefs where massive yellowfin tuna used to be caught every April, May, June. I saw that fishery virtually disappear. There's still plenty of yellowfin tuna there now, but you've got to go right out to the continental shelf to catch them most of the time. That inshore run of very big fish just got fished out. And it got fished out by recreational and commercial fishermen, and the recreationals have got to take a fair bit of the blame for that. But on the flip side of that, I grew up in an era when southern bluefin tuna were virtually unknown on the east coast. They used to get a few off Port Lincoln and places like that, but the southern bluefin tuna have made a massive comeback, and we're getting them up the east coast again now. Each year the run seems to be better and better. So it's been swings and roundabouts. I watched the whole decline of the yellowtail kingfish fishery when the floating fish traps came in. And we went from seeing lots and lots of big kingies. When I used to fish the rocks as a teenager, we were forever getting our fish monstered by big kingies. You'd have a bonito on, and a 30-kilo kingfish would just emerge out of the depths and take the bonnie off your line and things like that. That all disappeared, and that fishery crashed when the floating kingfish traps came in. And then they got rid of those, and the kingfish fishery has been rebuilding and rebuilding. Still got some problems. It's a little bit size overfished. There's a lot of small ones and not so many big ones, but it's on the comeback. Other things I've seen, the stocked impoundment fisheries. You know, I talked about the Murray cod and the yellowbelly, bass, barramundi up north, stocked in impoundments. Those fisheries didn't even exist when I was a young bloke. So those are whole new fisheries that have come along. Sure, they're sustained by hatchery-bred put-and-take fisheries, but they're still part of the overall picture, and they're still good news. The flathead I mentioned, the bream, the fact that we now regard bream as a sport fish rather than just a harvestable commodity to go out there and catch and eat, and people often choose to let bream go rather than keep them, especially the big breeders. So there's a lot of good news, and of course one of the best bits of good news is the fact that anglers are focusing a lot more on habitat these days. They're thinking about what it is that actually sustains the fish and creates our fisheries. And that's why organisations like OzFish Unlimited are so important, because they're allowing grassroots anglers like you and me to get involved in tree planting and re-snagging and those shellfish reefs and all those kind of things. So I would really strongly encourage you, if you've been thinking about it, to get out there and actually get involved in some of these programs. It really does feel good to go out and spend a day working up a bit of a sweat, getting some dirt under your fingernails and doing something to rebuild fish habitat And as you probably know, you can sign up here tonight if you're not already a member of OzFish Unlimited. So seriously consider doing that. But my bottom line is that, yeah, there's been swings and roundabouts, there's been losses and gains, but overall, things seem to be in a bit better shape today, to my eye, than they were certainly in the 60s and 70s. I remember reading an article in National Geographic when I was a kid about someone driving over a river that flowed into the Great Lakes in North America on the border of Canada and the US, throwing a cigarette out the window and the river caught fire. There was so much petrochemical waste in the river that it caught fire and burnt for several days. The Great Lakes were virtually dead in those days. They were so polluted there were no fish in them. You go to the Great Lakes today, you can go and troll and catch Chinook salmon and steelhead rainbow trout and coho salmon and lake trout and all sorts of other fish. So just because you've lost something at one part of history doesn't mean that you can't rebuild it and repair things. The fish that have come back into Sydney Harbour in my lifetime. Sydney Harbour was fairly badly polluted, very overfished, and it's turned around. We've got water quality back now. You've got sharks and kingies and tuna and stuff coming into Sydney Harbour now that just weren't there through the 60s and 70s. So don't get this idea that everything was better 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, because a lot of things are actually better today, and we can make them a lot better. As I said, there are some bad news stories as well. What's happened in our inland rivers in the last few years with the fish kills, water extraction, all the problems out there, and now this massive reboom of carp. The carp have always been a big problem out there, but since these last couple of floods, their biomass has just dramatically increased. We need to do something about that. So there are certainly bad news stories, but there are also lots of good news stories. And these days I prefer to look on the positive side and say, what can I do to help generate more good news when it comes to fishing? And that's why I put my hand up straight away to be an ambassador for OzFish Unlimited. I'm a huge admirer of what they do, and I would strongly recommend all of you to get involved in it. So thank you very much for giving me the time and listening to me, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Got a few questions. As I walk over, Starlo, I once asked you on the banks in Mildura on the Murray River if you could only fish fresh or salt water for the rest of your life. You had to choose one. What would it be? You gave me a really interesting answer. Why don't you share that?
Yeah, I think I surprised you a bit when I said freshwater, didn't I? Yeah. I mean, I've done far more saltwater fishing across my life than freshwater, but there's just something about freshwater fishing. Also, you don't have to wash your gear down when you come home.
Lazy boy.
Yeah, g'day, mate. I'm real jealous about fishing, and it's been great. And a lot of good stories, but happy fish paradise up here where we are. Have you tried Lake Macquarie?
I have indeed, and I fished Lake Macquarie the day before. No, it was yesterday. Oh my God, it seems so long ago. But Jono took me out there yesterday, and we had an absolute ball. We put in a big day, and we caught some lovely flathead, some bream, some silver trevally, some big tailor, and we finished off with 4 little dewies. So yeah, it was.
That's a good story.
It's a,
Just
yeah,
I
absolutely.
guided you onto those ones. We're just
Yes,
going. Got a question back.
I did let him catch one at the end.
There you go. Sit down, buddy. Shit. Come on, man.
No, you tell Jono, and then Jono will pass it on to me.
I'll come back to you. Do you want me to come back? I'll come back. Hello. Let's go. Yeah, go. Read it out, and we'll go. Go on. Okay. What do you go? What's your favourite lure that you ever designed?
I reckon that one yesterday that I used to kick Jono's butt, the black gold squidgy fish in 100 mil, is if there's one all round, you know, the old desert island thing. If you only had one packet of lures on a desert island, you had to catch a feed. That'd be it. 100 mil squidgy fish in black gold.
Got one back up here.
Cross country or Beastmaster and why?
Yeah, good questions. They're my last 2 boats. I'm in the Beastmaster at the moment, and the one we had before that was the cross country. The cross country really suited us up in Darwin. I prefer the Beastmaster down the coast because I do a little bit of offshore fishing, and it has got slightly better offshore credentials than the old cross country. But gee, I do miss the cross country. There's no doubt about that. Yep.
Hey mate, you said you've been doing a bit down in Tassie over the last few years. In terms of good news stories, bad news stories, like what do you think the impact of the salmon farms down there has been? And
Yeah, not good, generally speaking. You know, it's funny, a few years ago, a lot of us, I think, thought that aquaculture was going to be one of the big answers, cut back on the commercial fishing and get into fish farming instead. And it can be part of the answer, but when it's done super intensively, it's like any other monoculture. When you put a really intensive salmon farming operation into a bay or an estuary or whatever, the effluent and everything has a huge impact on the environment, so it can be a really negative thing. And there's ways to improve it. They can either put the cages well out to sea, which has got its problems in Tasmania because of weather, or they can bring them on shore. And onshore fish farming actually has a lot more going for it than the floating cages down there. The cages are a problem, there's no doubt about that. Yep.
G'day, Starlo. Just your thoughts on the small marine parks, just around the, for example, around the Port Stephens type area. Whether you believe in your time that they're doing anything significant, and also, where we're at with our regulations and bag limits and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the increase in regulation that we've gone through in the last 20 years or so. 30, 40, 50 years ago, there were no bag limits on most species. There were minimum legal lengths on a few, no bag limits on most of them, definitely no maximum size limits or slot sizes. We're seeing a lot more of that these days. I really welcome that stuff. I think as long as it's got a scientific backing and a reason for having it, I'm a big fan. Marine parks, I'm a little bit less of a fan of. I'm not opposed to the idea of marine parks, but again, I think the science has to show that they're there for a specific reason, and then the results have to be monitored. And I just think a lot of it's ad hoc. It's just done to win votes, and it's done piecemeal. They do a little bit here and a little bit there. Makes life so difficult. I fish in areas now where I've got to constantly be looking at the GPS to make sure I'm not going into a sanctuary zone or whatever. That's just hard work, and I just think it's unnecessary a lot of times. We need to. My idea, and and I didn't come up with this idea, but I can't see why we can't have marine parks work like farmers work their paddocks, where you leave a paddock fallow or whatever. So you create a marine park, have it there for 5 years, then open it, and make the chunk next to it a marine park and give it 5 years. Apart from anything else, when anglers went, if they're as good as their proponents claim them to be, when we got to go back into those marine parks after 5 years of not being fished, if the fishing's going to be as exceptional as they claim that it's going to be, we're all going to be saying, yeah, keep doing this, make some more up and down the coast, but don't just lock areas away and throw the key away forever. I think that's a really bad way to manage a fishery.
Right down the front.
You had a magazine cover there that featured carp on fly from 1980. Why do we feel like we've only discovered this in the last 5 years?
I think we feel like we've discovered a lot of things in the last 5 years that were actually around a long time ago. I can remember reading articles about guys catching snapper on bucktail jigs back in the 1970s and things like that. So, everything new is, or everything old is new again one day, and we rediscover it. There's plenty of stuff that was going on, but it just wasn't getting publicised back in those days. We've got social media and websites and everything now, and TV shows, so you see that stuff happening. But there's always been a few cutting-edge guys and girls that have been doing stuff like that for a long time. Yep.
Is there much tagging and information going around in the impoundment fish?
Yeah, there's been lots and lots of tagging done on impoundment fish, particularly in Queensland. Suntag up in Queensland do a great job on all of that. So they do know a lot about growth rates and recapture rates and stuff on a lot of the impoundment fish. One up there.
You meet a flatty down in where you are. Are they really that hard to catch down there?
Yep, a metre flathead. People talk about metre flathead all the time. I've never seen one. I'm 65. I've been fishing for 60 years. I've never seen a metre long flathead, not in the flesh. I've seen photos of ones on mats that are definitely over the metre. I've seen a 105, 106, a 108. They certainly exist, but I'll give you a little interesting statistic. The Flathead Classic on the Gold Coast has been going for 24 years, I believe. They average between 2,000 and 4,000 flathead each year caught during the Flatty Classic. The biggest one that's ever been, and so you can extrapolate that out, 23 years times an average of 4,000 per year is over 100,000 flathead. Biggest one ever caught was 98 centimetres. I'll leave you with that.
Okay, question for you is, your soft plastics, with scent or without? If so, what's the best?
Yeah, both. I love scent. I'm a real S Factor fan. I put S Factor on hard bodies. I put S Factor on bait. Seriously. I reckon it's magic stuff. I know, well, flies is a whole nother ball game. You know, yes, you open a can of worms, you start putting it on flies. But I have been known to do it in desperate situations. Look, even a really good scent like S Factor doesn't make a fish even swim across this room to take a lure. But what I think that it does is, if they get really close to it and they're a bit, am I going to eat it or not? If it's got S Factor on it, they 9 times out of 10 they will eat it. And the other big thing, and this is what a lot of people underestimate, when they get it in their mouth, they're a lot less likely to want to spit it out. And I think that allows a lot of people who aren't all that great at soft plastic fishing, don't detect the bites as just learning it. The fish hangs on long enough to either hook itself or for them to go, geez, there's something on there. Oh, it's a bloody fish. And so, yeah, I am a big fan of S Factor. But there's a few times I don't put it on, particularly out on the reef when the leather jackets and stuff are in plague proportions. They just eat your plastics when you put S Factor on them. So not all the time.